On February 27th, Mark Wiegert and Tom Fassbender pulled Stephen's 16-year-old nephew, Brendan Dassey, out of school and questioned him alone. On March 1st, Brendan was taken into custody and confessed to his and Stephen's involvement in the murder of Teresa Halbach. In a March 2nd press conference, Special Prosecutor Ken Kratz provided a timeline for those watching based off of information gathered from Brendan's confession. Brendan Dassey arrived home on the bus from school at 3:45 p.m. He got the mail and saw that one of the letters was for Stephen. As he approached Stephen's trailer, even from several hundred feet away, he began to hear a female voice screaming for help. He knocked on the door several times and waited until Stephen opened the door, partially dressed and drenched in sweat. Brendan then followed Stephen into Stephen's bedroom, where they saw a naked Teresa Halbach shackled to the bed. Stephen then invited Brendan to rape Teresa and urged him to cut her throat, which Brendan did. They then choked her to death and dragged her lifeless body outside, throwing her in the burn pit and shooting her in the head and in the stomach. Due to this testimony, 3 new charges were added against Steven Avery: sexual assault, false imprisonment, and kidnapping. Brendan brought on a new attorney, Len Kaczynski, who attempted to make a plea bargain with the prosecution once Brendan's confession was considered admissible by the judge. The judge ruled that even though Brendan was enrolled in several special education classes and his IQ was very much below average, there was no reason that he shouldn't have made rational decisions when he was being interrogated, and that the tapes show no evidence that he was frightened or felt coerced. On March 2nd, the day after Brendan's confession, investigators found a flattened bullet and empty shell casings for .22 caliber rounds in Avery's garage. The bullet fragment was washed by DNA specialist Sherry Culhane using a buffer, and she conducted all her tests on that resulting liquid. Teresa's DNA was found on this bullet fragment. However, the sample was contaminated when Culhane inadvertently introduced her own DNA into the negative control. She was training 2 new analysts, and as she was explaining protocol to them, her breath or saliva got into the sample, and her DNA was found in the resulting DNA profile along with Teresa's. It was revealed through the defense's questioning that Code Lead Detective Fassbender had called Culhane when she had received the sample for testing and told her to, quote, try to place her in his house or garage. While the majority of the bone fragments were found in the burn pit directly outside of Stephen's trailer, some were also found in a burn pit on the other side of the property, and fragments of pelvic bone were found in the quarry pile. The expert who took the stand gave her opinion that the episode of burning took place at the burn pit that was behind Steven Avery's garage. She claimed that the bones from all sites were from the same female, indicating that someone scattered them around, but that the lack of breakage suggests that the bones were found at Stephen's burn pit and were not moved from another site. However, forensic anthropologist Scott Fairgrieve disagreed, stating that usually the place where the most fragments are found, in this case the burn pit behind Stephen's place, is where they were moved to, not from. On May 12th, Brendan sat down with Kaczynski's investigator and wrote a very detailed, very different description of what happened the day of the murder. Keep in mind, this is 2.5 months after he confessed to torturing and killing Teresa. It went as follows. I went to school on that day and got home at 3:45 and went to my mom's house to play PlayStation until 5 o'clock p.m. till my mom came home, then I called my friend at 5:30 p.m. I watched TV until 6 o'clock and got a phone call at that time from Blaine, my brother's boss. I told him that Blaine went trick-or-treating with his friends. Then at 7 o'clock, I got a phone call from Steven and asked me to come over to the bonfire that night. Then I helped him pick up the yard and picked up a van seat, wood, a cabinet, and some tires. Then we threw them on the fire and we waited for the fire to go down and then got a phone call from 9 o'clock to 9:30 and it was my mom, and I told Steven that I was to be home by 10 o'clock and I was home at that time. Then I talked to my mom, then I went to bed. The day after he writes this, Fassbender and Wiegert interrogate Brendan again for 3.5 hours and get another confession out of him without Len present. Bobby Dassey, Brendan Dassey's brother and Steven's nephew, gave his testimony in the trial and stated that Avery asked Bobby and a friend to help him get rid of a body. The defense recounted this conversation with Steven and Bobby's friend Michael in a very different light. Michael was aware that Avery was one of the last people to see Teresa Hallback and joked that he had her in a closet somewhere. Avery responded by asking if he wanted to help him bury her body in a joking manner. It was stated that both men in the conversation laughed following their statements. The prosecution claimed in court that that conversation took place on November 3rd, while the defense claims, with the police reports, that the conversation took place on November 10th. Official reports are consistent with the defense. Although there are consistency issues with the information, Judge Willis denied the defense's request for mistrial and did not notify the jury. He has also denied the defense from suggesting any other suspects of Miss Hallback's murder other than Brendan Dassey. In the trial, excluding Brendan Dassey as a witness would mean that the 3 charges that were added after his testimony, sexual assault, kidnapping, and false imprisonment, should be dismissed. Ultimately, the state dismissed sexual assault and kidnapping as charges. His 4 charges are as stands: first-degree intentional homicide, mutilation of a corpse, felon in possession of a firearm, and false imprisonment. Barb's husband, Scott Taddick, testifies that he got home from the hospital, where he was visiting his sick mother at 2, then got ready and left for hunting. On his way to hunt, he passed Bobby Dassey on the road as he, too, was heading out to hunt. Scott says that when he returned home in the evening, he saw Stephen standing next to a fire as tall as a garage. In response to this testimony, Stephen's defender, Jerry Buting, pulls up a report taken 1 month after the murders in which Scott claims that he got back from the hospital at 3:15 and the flames were 3 feet high. So we can see some inconsistencies there. Bus driver Lisa Buckner says she dropped the Dassey boys off at home between 3:30 and 3:40, and she remembers seeing a woman taking photographs of a van at this time. The week before the state rests their case, they announced that the FBI has the results of a newly developed EDTA test, and the judge rules that it is admissible. The only other time this EDTA analysis has ever come into play was in the OJ case. If you find the presence of EDTA on the bloodstain, it indicates that the blood came from a tube. The FBI did not identify any of this EDTA in the blood from the RAV4. After the state rests their case, the judge grants Avery the dismissal of the false imprisonment charge because it was based on Brendan Dassey's unsupported testimony. After 3 days of deliberation, the jury found Avery guilty of first-degree murder and of possession of a weapon, and not guilty of mutilation of a corpse, and he was sentenced to life in prison without possibility of parole. As Stephen's case has ended, Brendan's case follows. In court, they recount Brendan's confession during the interrogation. It was stated that he walked into Teresa shackled to the bed and watched Stephen violently rape her, then stab her. Brendan handed Avery the knife to do this and assisted him, according to the confession. On February 20th, 2006, Kayla Avery was interviewed, who is Stephen's niece and Brendan's cousin. In the interview, she discussed how Brendan had been acting off lately, lost about 40 pounds, and would always cry uncontrollably. Mark Wiegert and Fassbender decided to re-interview Brendan on February 27th. In this interview, they made him comfortable with them and insinuated that he did see something and just asked for him to tell them what body parts he saw in the fire pit on the Avery property. Brendan confessed to seeing toes in the fire. On March 1st, Brendan was interviewed again. They played this interview in court, excluding the last hour and 38 minutes in which he told his mother that the police were getting to his head. During that interview, Brendan would often change his answer after his original answer to a question caused the detectives to call him a liar. There is no concrete scientific evidence placing Brendan at the crime scene. Following Brendan's arrest, Kayla was interviewed again. In her statement, she said that she had a conversation with Brendan about him seeing the fire and Teresa's body. When she testifies in court, Kayla confesses to making that conversation up that he told her anything about body parts. Brendan was put on the stand. He recounted that he went over to Stephen's after 7 and helped him throw junk in the yard onto the fire pit. Brendan said that the first time he had ever seen Teresa Hallback was on the news due to the fact that she was a missing person. When the prosecution questioned Brendan, he stated that he lied to the police and his mother about what he saw and what had happened. The specifics of what he says was his made-up story came from a book called Kiss the Girls. Ultimately, Brendan was found guilty on all charges. He was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of early release in 2048.